What if I told you that the most sophisticated road network in 19th century America wasn't built by the government, wasn't funded by railroads, wasn't engineered by trained surveyors with instruments and blueprints? What if the most durable, most efficient, most strategically brilliant transportation corridor in the entire western frontier was carved out by booths, hooves, and iron wheels, by people who had no GPS, no weather satellites, no fuel depots, no federal highway budget, no guarantee they would survive the journey? Think about what you take for granted when you drive somewhere. Paved surfaces, signs, rest stops, reliable fuel, a phone signal, the assumption that the road itself will hold. Now strip all of that away. Not just the modern conveniences, strip away the concept of a road as a permanent, maintained, engineered structure. Strip away the idea that someone, somewhere, is responsible for making sure you get through. That's the world the Santa Fe Trail was born into. And yet, and this is the part that stops people cold when they really think about it, sections of that trail still exist. Not as museums, not as reconstructions, as actual depressions in the earth, actual ruts cut so deep into the prairie soil by wagon wheels that the land itself remembers the weight. You can stand in Kansas or New Mexico today and look at the ground and see exactly where thousands of wagons passed, one after another, year after year, decade after decade, pressing the same line into the continent with the patient, relentless logic of necessity. How does a dirt path survive nearly 2 centuries? The answer isn't what you think. It never is with the Wild West. Imagine the Southern Plains in the early 1800s. Not the romanticized version. Not the postcard. The real thing. The sky is enormous. Brutally, overwhelmingly enormous, in a way that urban people in the modern world have simply never experienced. The horizon is a full 360 degrees of possibility and threat. The wind is constant. It carries grit that works into your eyes, your teeth, the folds of your skin. The grass is short and tough and seemingly endless, broken by ravines and creek beds and sudden rises of land that give no warning from a distance. Water is not guaranteed. That point cannot be overstated. You might travel 30 miles between reliable water sources. 30 miles in summer heat across exposed grassland, with animals that need water, with wooden wheels that shrink and crack in the dry air, with a body that is losing moisture every hour and getting nothing back. The Santa Fe Trail ran roughly 800 miles. Some interpretations put it closer to 900 depending on the route variant, connecting what is now Missouri to what is now Santa Fe, New Mexico. That distance, on foot or by wagon, represented weeks of travel under conditions that would be classified as an emergency by modern standards. Not an inconvenience. An emergency. And people did it. Deliberately. Repeatedly. For decades. The first thing you have to understand about the trail is that it didn't start as a trail. It started as an idea. And ideas in that era had consequences. A trader named William Becknell crossed into what was then the northern frontier of New Spain in the early 1820s with a small party and a load of goods. He wasn't pioneering a road. He was looking for profit. The Spanish colonial administration had been hostile to American traders for years. Crossing that border with merchandise was not only difficult, it was illegal. But political circumstances changed, and Becknell arrived at a moment when the newly independent Mexican government was open to commerce in a way the old Spanish administration had never been. He came back with his mules loaded with silver. Word traveled fast. It always did on the frontier, where information was currency just as surely as coin. Other traders followed. Then more. Then caravans. The singular act of one man crossing the plains for profit became, within a remarkably short number of years, one of the most active commercial corridors in the entire Western Hemisphere. But here's what most people miss about that early explosion of traffic. The trail didn't just get used. It got engineered, not by engineers, but by accumulated decision-making. Hundreds of people, independently, in response to the same terrain and the same threats, made the same choices. Where to cross a river. Where to camp before a waterless stretch. Which side of a ridge to follow. which ravine to avoid in spring because the runoff would make it impassable. Those individual decisions, repeated and confirmed, became the road. Nothing worked in isolation. The trail was not a single route. It was a system. A network of interdependent choices, each one making the next possible. Consider the river crossings. The Arkansas River runs roughly parallel to part of the trail's midsection, and for a significant stretch, traders had to decide when and where to cross it. Cross too early and you're fighting soft banks and uncertain depths. Cross too late and you're in territory where the water braids and widens and becomes unpredictable. The crossing points that survived, the ones that became permanent features of the trail, weren't chosen randomly. They were chosen because the geology of the riverbed at those specific locations allowed loaded wagons to cross without losing their wheels in mud or breaking an axle on hidden rock. People died learning which crossings worked. That knowledge was encoded into the trail. Think about that for a moment. The road itself is a record of mortality. Every feature of that route carries in it the residue of a decision that was tested against reality, often violently, and either validated or discarded. The trail is not a monument to adventure. It's a monument to problem solving under lethal conditions. The wagons themselves were a piece of this system that most people underestimate. The Conestoga wagon, often associated with the trail, was a marvel of low-technology engineering. The bed curved upward at both ends, which kept cargo from shifting on inclines, a detail that seems minor until you're descending a grade with several hundred pounds of trade goods and the wagon wants to jackknife. The wheels were designed with a specific dish, or outward angle, that helped them bear lateral stress on uneven ground without collapsing. The canvas cover created a microclimate inside that reduced moisture loss from perishable cargo. These weren't coincidences. They were solutions. Developed through failure. Refined through iteration. But the wagons were only part of the load-bearing system. The animals mattered just as much. Mules versus oxen was not a preference. It was a strategic calculation. Oxen were slower but could subsist on worse forage, and were less likely to be targeted by raiders who valued horses and mules more highly. Mules were faster and more heat-tolerant but required better feed and more water. The choice of draft animal changed your water schedule, your travel speed, your vulnerability, and your cargo capacity. It was a systems decision, not a personal one. And here's where the engineering of the trail becomes almost counterintuitive. The deepest ruts, the ones that are most visible today, the ones that have survived, were not a sign of damage. They were a sign of success. The ruts formed because wagons followed the same line repeatedly. Not because they were careless. Because that line was the optimal path. The vegetation had been cleared. The surface had been compressed. The loose material had been displaced. A wagon following an established route was riding on a road surface that had already been processed by hundreds of previous crossings. The ground was harder. The lateral movement was constrained. The draft animals were working against a predictable surface instead of an unknown one. The deeper the ruts, the more reliable the road. This is the logic that most people don't expect when they think about frontier travel. They imagine chaos and improvisation. What they don't expect is system thinking. Emergent engineering. A road that debugged itself over time through the collective intelligence of everyone who used it. Nothing worked in isolation. The trail was a living document. There were water stops, some natural, some improved by travelers who dug out springs or cleared debris from creek beds. There were landmark systems, not printed on paper but carried in memory and passed from guide to trader to wagon captain. Certain rock formations, certain ridge profiles, certain tree configurations near water sources. The information network of the trail was oral and experiential, which meant it was also lossy. A bad guide or a wrong memory could cost lives. But it was also continuously updated, because everyone who traveled the route added their experience to the collective. The psychological dimension of the trail is something modern analysis often overlooks. Imagine traveling for 6 weeks with no communication with the outside world. No way to know if conditions ahead had changed. No way to send word back if you encountered a problem. The decision-making structure of a wagon train had to be both flexible and hierarchical, because the cost of a wrong decision accumulated over days and weeks in ways that couldn't be corrected quickly. Wagon captains were not elected for charisma. They were selected for judgment, for the ability to read terrain, weather, animal behavior, and human morale simultaneously, and to make decisions that balanced immediate safety against long-term progress. A captain who pushed too hard lost animals and people to exhaustion. A captain who moved too cautiously ran out of season and risked being caught in the mountain passes by early snow. The mathematics of survival on the Santa Fe Trail were unforgiving. And yet, and this is the part that deserves the most attention, the trail worked. Not occasionally. Consistently. For decades, across thousands of crossings, the commercial traffic on the Santa Fe Trail moved goods, silver, ideas, and people across nearly 1,000 miles of hostile terrain with a reliability that, proportionally, is difficult to dismiss. Some researchers argue that the trail's success rate, measured against the conditions it operated in, represents one of the most efficient logistical achievements of the 19th century. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't. People died. Wagons were lost. Entire caravans were sometimes turned back. But as a system, as a self-correcting, community-maintained, organically engineered corridor, it performed at a level that formal infrastructure projects of the same era often failed to match. The military eventually recognized this. The United States Army established a series of posts along or near the trail, not to build the road. The road already existed and functioned, but to provide a security layer on top of a system that was already operational. Fort Leavenworth, Fort Dodge, Fort Union. The military plugged into the trail's infrastructure, not the other way around. This reversal of the expected relationship between government and infrastructure is one of the most striking features of the Santa Fe Trail's history. The frontier didn't wait for the government to build a road. The frontier built the road, and the government followed. By the time the railroad reached Santa Fe in the early 1880s, the trail had been operational for roughly 60 years. The railroad didn't make the trail obsolete immediately. The transition took time, as new distribution networks always do, but the commercial logic that had sustained the overland route for 6 decades gradually shifted to the faster, more reliable, more weather-independent rail system. And the trail began to go quiet. But it didn't disappear. Here is the thing about ruts cut into prairie soil by iron-wheeled wagons under multi-ton loads, repeated thousands of times over decades. The compression of the soil at those specific points is not superficial. It goes down. The capillary structure of the earth itself was altered. The vegetation that grew back, and it did grow back, grew differently in those zones, because the soil beneath had a different density, a different drainage pattern, a different relationship to moisture. From the air, and in the right light conditions, the ruts are visible as differences in vegetation color and growth pattern. On the ground, in places where erosion hasn't filled them, they are physical depressions that you can walk into and feel the walls on either side of you. The trail is not a historical artifact. It is a geological fact. Modern satellite imaging has allowed researchers to trace sections of the route that were previously mapped only approximately, finding alignments that match the historical record with striking precision. The trail, it turns out, was surveyed with a consistency that implies either exceptional collective memory or a degree of formal coordination that the historical record doesn't fully capture. Possibly both. Some sections of the trail corridor are now designated as a National Historic Trail, protected by federal law. But the protection is almost unnecessary for the physical ruts themselves. The land remembers. The compression is there. Short of active earth-moving, those depressions are not going away on any human timescale. Which brings us to the question that the Santa Fe Trail ultimately poses to the modern world. We build roads with enormous investments of capital, technology, materials, and institutional knowledge. We maintain them continuously. We redesign them when they fail. And yet the roads we build today, without maintenance, without protection, without use, begin to fail within decades. The asphalt cracks. The subbase washes out. The shoulders erode. The Santa Fe Trail, built by wagon wheels and animal hooves with no engineering budget and no maintenance crew, has outlasted every surface road built in America in the first century after its own abandonment. The lesson isn't that primitive technology is better. The lesson is that a road used consistently, by people who understood the terrain and the physics and the stakes, develops a resilience that engineered surfaces sometimes don't reach. The trail was tested by the conditions it had to survive, continuously for decades. Every weakness was found and either corrected or avoided. The final product, the actual physical trace in the earth, was the distillation of all that testing. We forget this when we think about infrastructure. We imagine that engineering happens before use. The Santa Fe Trail is evidence that the most durable engineering sometimes happens through use itself. The Wild West was not a place of chaos waiting for civilization to arrive. It was a place where civilization was being invented, in real time, under conditions that made failure immediately and unambiguously visible. The people who built the Santa Fe Trail were not pioneers in spite of the difficulty. They were engineers because of it. The road they left behind is still there. 800 miles. Nearly 2 centuries. Visible from space. Think about that the next time you're sitting in traffic on a freshly repaved highway, wondering why the lane markers are already fading after 2 seasons. The dust is still settled in those ruts. The grass grows differently there. The earth holds the memory of every wheel that ever passed. And if you look at the right map, in the right light, on a clear day over the southern plains, you can still see exactly where they went. If this story changed the way you see the frontier, if you never thought a dirt road could outlast a civilization and make it into the modern age, hit that subscribe button. Because there are dozens of stories like this one, buried in the dust of the Old West, waiting to be found.